Hi there, you're very welcome to my first ever blog video, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to set up a very simple, effective, generic repository pattern for Entity Framework. So something very simple in that it's quick to set up, so even for the smallest of projects you can use this pattern, but also something quite scalable and effective that you can use for much larger, more demanding projects. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to get started by setting up a database. So Northwind database. And we just download it here from CodePlex. If I open up this, we'll see we get the northwind.back. And I'm going to go into my toDelete, and I'm going to put it in there, get my SQL Server, restore the database. Now I'm using SQL Server 2008 Standard Edition, just because that's what's on my computer, but you could very similarly, if that's even a word, use SQL Express. So there you are. I'm just going to go ahead and restore that. Excellent. Go new project. Start with the unit test project. I always start with a test project. Okay, always start with a test project. So a.blog. So when you're naming solutions and assemblies and projects, start with your company name, then your project. This particular test project is going to be, so we're building a repository pattern. I'm just going to keep it in there. And let's go. A.blog, we have our solution and we've created our test. So there's my test project. So I'm going to add another project in here. I'm going to call it, I'm going to first of all select what type of project, class library. And I'm going to call it a.blog.data.repository. And I hate the way it adds these classes in here, but we'll just delete that. And I'm going to go add new project, and I'm going to call this a.blog data. So I'm just going to create this project in there. So this is where my business logic would reside, or my general data libraries would reside. Okay, so we have a repository. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a new item in here. I'm going to add an ADO.NET entity data model. I'm going to call it blog data model. Okay, so I'll get these four choices. Okay, so the main categories of choice are model first versus code first. If you're building a product where the code is the principal, so if you're building an application or a software product where the code is the primary, it's the principal, it's all about the code drives everything, and the database is just there to facilitate, then go for code first, because it suits that perfectly. You know, code first has a lot of useful features that allow you to drive and update the schema based on what's going on in your code. If you have a database and your database is the principal, so in other words that you have at the core of your organization a database, or your project a database, and a lot of systems kind of work around that, people generate reports from it, there's other software that accesses it, then you go for a model first. Your database is the principal. So in this case we have our Northwind database, and we're going to pretend that the Northwind database is a very important database at the center of our project or our organization. So I'm going to select model first, and I can see here Northwind is already set up, so I'm just going to call this my blog entity context. So I'm going to click next, and we're going to go for Entity Framework 6.0. And I'm just going to bring in the tables. So a.blog.data.repository. Now I'll just wait for this to finish. So what it's doing now is it's getting the schema from the database and creating this EDMX file, which is essentially an XML representation of our data model, or model view, as it can also be called. And we got some templates, which I'm going to come to in a second. But I'm going to add some solution folders in here. I'm going to call one test, or let's say I'm just going to call this data. And I'm just going to put all this in here. And what I'm going to do is, if I expand these templates, you can see here it's created all these entities for me. And I don't like them being in the repository. So I want to create a new project. And I'm going to call this a.blog.entity. And I'm going to create another solution folder. And I'm going to call that domain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in here, I'm going to add a new item. And I'm going to select Tangible T4. If you don't have this, just go on to Tangible T4 and download their plugin for Visual Studio. And I'm going to put in a blanket template. And I'm going to call this entity.tt. And what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to copy the contents of this particular template and put it in here. Now, when I try to save that, it'll give me an error saying it cannot find probably the EDMX that it refers to. So you can see here it cannot find this. So we have to update that particular reference. So a nice little trick for doing this is to, open the containing folder, put in // and it's in this particular one and it's in this particular file. So we'll go ahead and copy that. And I'm just going to paste that in here and save. So now we have all our entities being generated down here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this one. So I'm just going to try and compile that. And you'll see I'm going to get all these errors. So Alt-Enter. But what we have to do, regardless, is in my context here, I just need to put in a.blog.entity. There you go. So we're good to go. So we have our entity framework, ADO kind of .NET set up, and we have our entities, and that's everything we need to start querying data. We're going to set up a nice little repository pattern. So I'm going to set up consumer tests, and I'm going to do query all customers, no exception. So I'm going to go ahead now and get my list of customers from the database. So I'm going to go for my non-existent repository, and it's a generic repository, so I'm going to use generics. So customer. So my resharper has added in my reference to blog entity in there. And so first off, we don't have a repository, so I'm going to create field repository, and I'm going to have to create a signature for my repository. And creating a signature, this is the most fundamental part of setting up your repository pattern. So I'm going to create that interface, and I'm going to Alt-Enter move to another file. And I'm going to grab that file and I'm going to bring it up here to my a.blog.data, and very important, I'm going to delete the one down here. And I'm going to update my declarations, and I'm going to make this public. So there you go. So I'm accessing an interface here. So as far as my test is concerned, there is no entity framework, there is no database. It doesn't care where the data is coming from. All I know is I want to get a collection of customers from this repository. I don't care if it's in memory, if it's coming from a file, a web service, or whatever. So iRepository is a very useful way to abstract the actual implementation from the actual usage. So I have no method all customer, so I'm going to create a method all customer, which is there. So we have object, and because I know I'm a couple of steps ahead, I know that this needs to be iQueryable. And it's generic, so I'm going to go iQueryable for each, and I'm just going to call it item. So I'm going to go trace, there you go, system.trace information, and I'm going to go customer name, and I'm going to put in, I know this takes arg, I'm going to item dot company name. Okay, so I might change this to company name, and I'm going to have to put in my parameters. So there you go. So there's a very, very legitimate test. Now, of course, this is going to be null. We have to instantiate it. So we have to create our test initialize. So I'm going to create a repository is equal to. So now we have to start creating something for a repository. We're going to create a blog repository. And using Alt Enter. Now, if you don't have ReSharper, you'll get Control Dot options to do this fancy stuff where I'm creating the classes on the fly. So I'm just going to Alt Enter on that, and I'm going to move to another file name, and I'm going to move it out of here because I want all my projects to be able to use my new repository. So a.blog.data.repository, and I'm going to implement the members in here. Excellent. And oops, we have to go down here. We have to delete this one because it'll end up confusing it. So I'm just going to put in F9 RT. So when I said RT there, Control RT debugs the current test, and then F10, and we get a very, very expected exception here, not implemented. We know from earlier on when we set up our blog data model, it set up some stuff, particularly the blog entity context. This is what links our entity model to the actual database. So we have this context, so we need to create an instance of this, obviously. So in my blog repository, I'm going to create a constructor. And in here, I'm going to is equal to new blog entity context. There you go. And what I'll do is I'll create a field like so. And now we need to do something down here. So I'm going to return context. And see, when I go context, you get the list of all these things, customers, categories, and so on. But it's generic, so I don't want to return the customers. So let's just see if we have a generic. Returns a non-generic set, so we want generic. So returns a DB set instance for the access. Excellent. That's exactly what we need. And we're getting out an error, so it must be a reference type in order to use it as a parameter for T entity. So we do so by going where T is class. So that's a reference type. Now this is kicking up a fuss. The constraints for the parameter T of method a blog must match constraints parameter I repository. Consider, okay, fair enough. So I go back to my repository. So what I do in here, I have to also do back here. Is that right? And we put a semicolon here, and there you go. And this is probably telling me I can make it read only. So there we go. And also I need to rename that. So change that to a.blog.data.repository, and now we're in good shape. So if I go back now to my consumer tests, and now and try and run it, I should get a different exception. So no connection string name blog entity context could be found in the application config file. So we can get past that one. So we go to our blog repository. We have an app config in here. And where's our test? So our test also has an app config. So we're just missing a connection string as far as I know. So we have all this other stuff in there. So I'm just going to go to app config and I'm just going to copy the connection string. I'm just going to paste the connection string in there, and now I'm going to go to my test so I can go straight to it from here. I'm going to go to debug selected tests, and here you go. Let's just step over that, and bingo, we're up and running. So we've got our 91 customers, and we have an abstract generic repository implementation working. So I'm just going to play that through. So we should get a green tick up here. Excellent. So there you go, we're done. I'm going to go to customer for a sec. Now in some cases we're going to want to maybe expand certain properties. And here I have orders. So this is what we call a navigation property. And these are all defined in our data model here. So you can see here if I go to customer, we have orders and customer demographics and so on. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to go to consumer test and I'm going to create another test. And customers, all customers including orders. And I'm going to create a new method called all including, and in here I'm going to specify, first of all, we'll go ahead and create that method. So that'll create it in our signature, and we also have to put in this where is class, no doubt. And what I want to specify in here is I want to specify the properties I want to expand. So I'm going to use a lambda expression and I'm going to specify orders. Now we need to adjust this a little bit, so we need to change the site type queryable for starters. And what I'm going to put in here is I'm going to put a func, and it's going to be t, and then out is going to be object. Excellent. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go repository. I want all including from customer including orders, the to list. As soon as I compile that, I'll get an error saying that something using that signature needs to be updated. So alt and enter on this. Now one of the things I should be mindful of as well is when we're dealing with databases, it's very important that we dispose of our resources afterwards. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to inherit from iDisposable, and I'm going to implement that as well. So I'm going to go underscore context dot dispose, and I'm going to make sure that the context is not null. So we're going to have a set in here. So I'm going to go var retval is equal to context dot set, and I'm going to return retval. But what we want to do in here is now I want to change this to params. Okay, and I want to go for each include and item in include, and I'm going to go retval is equal to retval dot include, and I'm going to pass in item. Now, okay, so this is a delegate, so we don't want to specify. We actually want to specify. All we care about is the name, because you can see in here under include it's looking for a string path, and I know there's an extension available to me that allows me to specify an expression. Now if you don't know the difference between expressions and funcs, I'm going to have another, so I'm just going to add expression to the mix here. So parameter expression func, and what I'm going to do here is, there you go, so I know there's an extension in there for that. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change our retval to queryable. Now what's happening, of course, is our signature doesn't match, so we need to change that. So I know that I have to go expression. You know what? I'm just going to copy it. So now our expression's updated. And now if I go back to my consumer tests, I don't have to change anything and do a quick debug. And I step over that list. We should see we have 91. So if I add a watch on that, and I expand that list, and I take any of those particular items, you'll see I have also got the orders in there as well. And you see the context is done in a way that we have a circular reference. So we have our orders. When we go into orders, we have customer, and it goes back up again, and we can go to orders and so on. So it goes on forever and ever and ever, which can cause some problems with your serializers. To that later on. And there you go. And what we'll do is we'll change the functionality of this particular test. So we'll just go company name, and then we'll just do orders. And what I can do is item.orders.count. So orders, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some more queries. So I'm actually going to change this around a little bit. So just to show you how flexible this little repository is. So including orders, all customers, select company name and order count. So I'm just going to in here, so I'm not going to even bother with the expand on this, and I'm going to go dot select, and I'm going to go s, and then I'm going to go new bracket s dot company name, and then s count is equal to s dot orders dot count. You actually don't need that. That's pretty cool. So we can just get that, and so this will refine our select statement. So this will produce an anonymous object. So instead of this particular one, which will select all from orders and all from customer, so it's a very, very big query, getting a lot of data back from the database, this one will actually generate a very, very efficient query. And I can show you how by, let's say, doing a quick test. So if I'm going to go to a quick query, and then var list is equal to query dot toList. So we're going to follow this through on all our tests. I'm going to go query, oops, and I'm going to take that out. And we're just going to have a look at what gets produced. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I'm going to put a breakpoint up here. And I'm going to recompile. So you can see our number of tests are starting to grow. So I'm just going to debug selected tests. I'm starting with this one. So if I step over that, so what we need to do is we'll have a look at the profiler. So let's have a look at the SQL that's been generated. So if I step over, so notice it's only here. So when I step over this particular line, we'll have a look at what SQL has been generated. So there you go. So there's the SQL statement that's just been generated. So we have everything from our customer, and then what we have here then is our actual order information. Okay, so we'll go to our next test. So if I run over that, if I look at this one now, you can see here we have just the customers table because we haven't specified an including. So we'll play that through, and then finally we have our all including again. In this case we're just selecting company name and the orders count. So if I step over this particular one, you'll see that it's selecting the company name and it's selecting the count from orders. If we want to actually put in some constraints, so I'm actually going to do something now where I'm going to go and get all customers with more than 5 orders. Okay, and then I can just go where p.orders.count is greater than 5. And what we'll do now is we'll have a look at that particular one. when I step over to list here, you'll see now that the SQL that's been generated now has a where clause in it. And you can see there it's checking where the count is greater than 5. So if I run that particular query on its own, you can see here I get this very, very efficient query. So in other words, how you compose a queryable dictates the SQL that gets generated by this iQueryable provider. And that's that.